My name is Peter Foster. I am the public policy editor of the Financial Times and long-time Brexit watcher, not all of it at the Financial Times, previously at the Daily Telegraph, where I think I was often viewed as the last Remainer in the basement. I have been following Brexit right from the very start. I used to be the Washington editor. I came back to London in 2015, September, and followed the referendum of June 2016. And then as Europe editor of the Telegraph, the negotiation that led first to the divorce deal, the withdrawal agreement, and then right through to the signing of the trade and cooperation agreement in 2020. And latterly, and in some ways, the most interestingly, the implementation of Boris Johnson's trade deal, or reverse trade deal, as we might call it. I wrote a book last year, What Went Wrong with Brexit and What to Do About It. And some of you may have read it or flicked through it. And I don't want to repeat it, but I do want to start with the fact that any discussion about what we want to do about Brexit, what you think ought to be done to fix Brexit, if you think it needs fixing, I think has to begin with a proper understanding of why Brexit ended the way that it did, with a very bare bones Canada-style free trade agreement, which in lots of ways is very inadequate for $1 trillion or trillion euro, I should say, trading relationship that operates with very highly integrated supply chains across very high intensity borders, the short straits, the Channel Tunnel, and the roll-on, roll-off ferries. What do we mean by a Canada-style trade deal? Why is it going to be so difficult, in my view, to put Humpty back together again? So, as I was saying, we have very high frequency, high volume trading relationship, lots of mixed loads flying in trucks across the Channel Tunnel. And what Boris Johnson did when he did the trade and cooperation agreement was essentially do a reverse trade deal. Trade deals reduce barriers to trade. And that's not just customs and tariffs, but actually in the modern world, it's a lot to do with regulation. And the trade and cooperation agreement, which the EU, with its tongue in its cheek, likes to call its deepest ever trade deal, is, of course, miles away from single market membership. So what do we mean by single market membership? What we mean is being part of a regulatory envelope with a single referee, the European Court of Justice, and OLAF, the EU fraud agency, and a single set of rules which allow the 28, now 27 members of the European Union to trade as one bloc. And so what Boris Johnson did in order to repatriate sovereignty was to do a deal that fitted across his red lines, which was not being part of the EU single market, not being part of the EU customs union, not accepting free movement, and not paying into EU budgets. And that had a much deeper impact. I mean, the Office of Budget Responsibility, and probably everyone on this call knows this, sees a 15% hit to UK exports and imports. Why does it do that? Because when you're outside those institutions, you lose what's called the presumption of compliance. So take one example that I talk about in the book, organic teas. Now, after Brexit, the UK actually has the same regulation for organic teas as the EU does, because it's the same rules. We imported them in, and they are identical. And yet, if you sell organic teas into Europe, you lose the presumption of compliance. You have to show up at the border with a piece of paper and a stamp that proves that your teas conform to organic standards that are considered acceptable to place your good on the EU market. And more than that, you actually get treated differently when you show up to the Polish border and the German border and the Italian border, because the single market only operates as a single market when you're inside it. When you're outside it, when you're a third country, you've lost that presumption of compliance. And so the single market, even though the EU is one trade bloc, actually operates in lots of ways with a great deal of variety. It can be, effectively 27 different markets. And so when we talk about regulation kind of later down the tracks, the thing to remember is the old adage that alignment doesn't get you access. Alignment doesn't get you access. And I think it's really important when we think about moving back towards the European Union, that you'll often hear people saying, let's dynamically align, let's follow the rules. Well, always remember that alignment doesn't get you access. You follow those EU rules on organic teas, but if you're not part of the EU club, if you're not part of the EU single market, the customs union, and the single regulatory envelope, it doesn't help you. You're just sucking up rules and costs without getting the benefits, which is to trade freely with those 28 countries. So that's why the UK chemical industry was really cross when EU REACH was brought in. Some of you will have heard of EU REACH, the chemicals protocol. People forget the British chemical industry bitched furiously about that. But once they'd sucked up the cost of doing it, they then, of course, didn't want it to go away because it was the gateway that allowed them to trade freely with 27 other markets. Now, we're in a new environment. The Labour Party have come in and people go, well, why don't we just align with the chemicals legislation? Well, go and talk to the chemical industry and they'll go, well, hang on, we need to be careful what we wish for here, because the second version of REACH is incredibly onerous. But if it doesn't get us access, do we want all that cost and bureaucracy? So that's my preamble to explain why putting Humpty back together again is going to be complicated, long-winded, and difficult for technical legal reasons, as well as some of the political reasons that we'll come on to. We obviously had this period where we left, where Boris Johnson and David Frost negotiated this pretty inadequate trade deal, given the frequency and velocity of UK trade with Europe. And of course, irony of ironies, whilst they were telling everybody that doing a reverse trade deal with Europe, our largest market, didn't matter, wasn't going to really hit our trade, they were trying to persuade people that doing real trade deals to reduce barriers with markets far away was somehow going to compensate for doing the reverse trade deal. Both things couldn't be true. So we have the period with Johnson and Frost. We have the TCA coming in 2020 and the early years of its implementation, a lot of the effects masked by COVID and then by Ukraine. And along comes the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, and with the same red lines as Boris Johnson. No single market, no customs union, no free movement. And so whilst the Labour Party derides Boris Johnson's Brexit deal, quite rightly in my view, it actually is sticking to the same red lines that created the deal. It says it wants to do a number of things on top of the TCA, but fundamentally, Keir Starmer wants to build on the TCA. So let's look at the things that Keir Starmer wants to do and whether they'll make much difference. There are only three things in the manifesto that Keir Starmer wants to do: a veterinary agreement with the European Union, a deal on touring musicians to make it easier to do for touring musicians to work and travel in Europe, and the mutual recognition of professional qualifications. Well, let's take each of those three in turn, because in the manifesto, the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, they say this all the time, say that they want to tear down the barriers to trade with Europe, while sticking to the same red lines that erected those barriers in the first place. So take each one in turn. A veterinary deal. Could the UK do a veterinary deal with the EU? Yes, it could. The EU have said you can do a veterinary deal, and you can do one, but you're going to need to be dynamically aligned with the EU. It means you're going to have to follow EU regulation, and importantly, going back to the whole point about alignment giving you access, you're also going to have to follow and accept the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice and OLAF, the fraud agency, to ensure that you are enforcing the EU equivalent rules and regulations, which will reduce the barriers to trade, reduce the frequency of checks and the need for export health certificates and other bureaucracy around agri-food. Would that be valuable to the UK economy? Yes. Would it be valuable in the context of a $1 trillion GDP? Not really. We're talking fractions of 1%, of total UK GDP. Doesn't mean you don't want to do it, but is it part of Rachel Reeves' growth narrative? Is it going to make food cheaper in the supermarket? No, not really. When you crunch the numbers, Jundu at Aston University was modelling the impact on increased exports to the UK, to the EU, about 600 million euros in agri-food. When you look at the potential uplift, you're still talking about relatively small amounts of economic uplift. The UK, I think, is still discussing whether it can accept being dynamically aligned. I think the UK will want some kind of fig leaf that puts a certain amount of barrier between itself and the European Court of Justice, very similar to the governance mechanism that you see across the TCA at the moment, where both sides can appeal, and then there's an arbitration panel. But it tells you something about no single market, no customs union, no free movement, that actually UK officials, UK politicians on the Labour side are still nervous about accepting directly the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Point two, a deal on touring musicians. Is that going to change the price of fish? Not really. We have good touring musicians, we have good exports, we're good at music, etc., good at TV, etc. But there's a problem there, which was that the Labour Party, I think, went for this deal on touring musicians because the lobby was very strong, Elton John and others lobbying for it, and they thought it was a tier below the free movement, or rather the youth mobility deal that the EU had asked for. But there's a trouble. The EU, according to facts and documents that I've seen in a story I wrote the other day, told the Conservative government there couldn't be a deal on touring musicians because in order to make it work, the UK would have to get a special pass on the permits needed to move instruments and other bits and bobs. They would have to get a free pass or a cherry pick pass on cabotage, which are the rules about how many stops your trucks can make. And they would have to get dilutions to rules about your ability to provide services in the EU single market. Why could the UK not have those rules? Why were the Tories told at the Partnership Council in March that they weren't available? Because the UK has said it wants no single market, no customs union, no free movement of people. And so Labour actually, by putting that in their manifesto, in their demand list, were actually implicitly saying, we want what the Tories were told they couldn't have because, well, I think because we're nicer than the Tories, because we want a security pact, we want to be good neighbours. But actually, when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, they want the same. No single market, no customs union, no free movement. What about the last of the three, the mutual recognition of professional qualifications? Well, actually, there is already a provision in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement that allows you to do the mutual recognition of professional qualifications. There's a similar provision in the EU-Canada deal. And it's instructive, I think, that it took the Canadians 9 rounds of negotiations in the best part of the year to get one deal covering architects. And so, I bring that up just to show you the kind of relative limits for all of the rhetoric of what Labour are actually trying to do. Now, I know they want a security pact. They want to try and bleed the security element into questions of supply chains. But, fundamentally, security is not done via the EU. The EU is not a security trade power. The current president, Ursula von der Leyen, wants to increase the scope of cooperation on defense, etc. But fundamentally, as we've seen with Ukraine invaded by Russia, and in fact, perfectly effective sanctions generated by the G7 effectively and NATO, security operates largely out with the EU. And whilst the UK wants to be part of EU potentially defence procurement, and whilst it would show goodwill if we went into, say, some of the Balkan security programs like Operation Althea, it's not the same thing as reconnecting that relationship. So what are some of the other things that the UK might do? I think one important one, which is sort of technical but underestimated, is relinking carbon markets, relinking our emissions trading schemes, which were separated at Brexit. Again, there's provision for that in the TCA, so that as the EU introduces its carbon border taxes in 2026, UK companies are not having to provide so much documentation to prove that the inputs in their goods are have paid an equivalent carbon price. And you know, the idea of the carbon tax is that, you know, it stops people importing high carbon content steel and fertilizer, etc., from other jurisdictions where there isn't a carbon price paid, in order to level the playing field inside the EU single market. And so when you put all of that together, all of that ambition, at a technical level, it's quite limited. And actually, you know, what you see now, I was in the Midlands just recently talking to a company that makes aerospace parts, and they have a French parent, and you know, they can already feel how those integrated supply chains mean that being outside the EU puts them at a marginal competitive disadvantage. It doesn't mean it's impossible to send your parts into the EU, but as you start to add in a carbon border tax or a supply chain due diligence or a deforestation directive, what you see over time is that for a business inside the single market, the challenge of dealing with the UK slowly gets bigger over time. And it only needs to be a little bit trickier for an alternative inside the single market to look attractive. So actually, when you look at the Jundu analysis of total EU-UK trade, what you see actually is aerospace and defence and autos holding up reasonably well. But I think what we don't know is that when the sunk costs have come out of those supply chains, so the existing models are all, you know, where you've already basically created the supply chain and you're not going to go elsewhere because you are just going to have to pay X amount more for the paperwork and for the customs work and for the CBAM work. But when the French parent of this company, and this company already feels this risk, considers where it's going to make its next investment, where it's going to make its next factory, then I think, you know, a lot of UK businesses that don't have really proprietary technology, you know, can't compete necessarily on price because energy is more expensive here than in large parts of the continent, will start to find it difficult to remain in those supply chains. And that is the ongoing kind of sclerotic impact of Brexit. But the bad news is that nobody lives the counterfactual. So if you look at the latest Ipsos tracker that came out recently about the issues that matter to people, Europe now is right down at the bottom. It doesn't mean that businesses aren't still sucking up the costs, all that technical stuff that I've been talking about. It's just that nobody lives the counterfactual. No one opens the window into, you know, and looks across at the house, you know, next door that's living in a world where we didn't leave the EU. And when you have a political a government and a political operation that actually, because of, you know, the impact of the reform vote and because of the number of constituencies that are, you know, have quite slim majorities, and the Tory majority was split by reform, it's not really clear where the political driver would be to really make a quite radical argument, given the context of British politicians in Europe in the last 40 years, about unwinding the ratchet that is slowly pulling us away from Europe. Even where we stand still, Europe continues to regulate, continues to come up with new rules, and over time we slowly move away. And so there is a legal and technical block, but there's also a political block there where actually, yeah, there is a European movement, and there are, you know, Stella Creasy and some pressure in Parliament, but you know, Labour MPs are not going back to their constituencies and being harangued by the constituents about the state of Brexit. You know, the polling would suggest that's just not happening. The issue, indeed, is just fading into the background. And so you then see how that looks from the other side. So I spend still quite a lot of time talking to people in Europe. And, you know, Europe, it's 50+% of our trade, but it's a much smaller proportion of total EU trade. And so, you know, what does Europe hear when the Prime Minister says no single market, no customs, no free movement? It hears limited ambition. And it asks itself, is it really worth getting back into another protracted negotiation with the Brits to achieve something that is really pretty limited in scope? And in any event, the European Union runs a surplus in goods. We've not erected much of a border between the EU and the UK. So EU exports are not subjected to the same level of checks as UK exports to the EU. And whilst, yes, there are bits of the Dutch economy or the German economy that are exposed, yes, while there is goodwill and a desire to move on, and, you know, to be fair to Rishi Sunak with the Windsor Framework Agreement, he had very good relations with von der Leyen. He'd already started moving on. But, you know, the UK doesn't really want a really deep deal. And one symbol of that, and I'm sure we'll talk about this when we get to questions, and I'll shut up quite shortly, is, you know, the fact that the UK can't get past the politics of doing a youth mobility deal. You know, it chose that quite limited to deal on offer of a deal on musicians because it wanted to avoid a situation where it was accused of bringing back free movement by the back door. And so with this limited ambition, you have to ask yourself how a Labour government that doesn't really see European rapprochement as a really core part of its EU, of its regrowth story, or it would never have imposed those red lines, in my view. How do you galvanize a Europe into kind of a deep deal when that's not what we're asking for? And so the danger, I think, is that actually we end up with a sort of a situation not dissimilar actually with the Tories, where the government talks in quite broad and big terms about its relation with Europe. You know, the Tories talked about divergence, they didn't do much diverging. Labour talks about tearing down the barriers of trade, but they don't do much of that. They just manage the problem. And then in that scenario, and this is the last thing I will say, it becomes very difficult to end up to get beyond a kind of repeat, a new version of the negotiation that was so sticky last time. There is, you know, a kind of tripwire clause, for example, in the TCA that says that the energy clauses, which allow us to trade energy with the EU, won't be renewed until the fish deal is settled. You know, the French are pretty clear internally that they don't even want to begin a negotiation until we've done a deal on fish. You know, these old sticking points will be difficult to get past given the level of ambition. And so, you know, as a reporter, you know, I think we will do some bits around the edges. I think we probably will be relatively closer, you know, at the end of 5 years than we are now, but I don't see a radical transformation. And the longer the attritional divergence goes on, the less likely it's going to be that you're going to put Humpty back together again, because business just moves on. Someone at Labour Party conference said to me that, you know, well, why can't business align and then we can be ready to go in the second term? You know, the chemical industry is not going to, you know, suck up all that extra cost for no additional access if it's not, you know, on the off chance that, you know, Keir Starmer wakes up 5 years' time and decides we're going to rejoin the EU when all of the direction of travel looks in the opposite direction. And actually, last thing I'll say, it may be that actually if Labour really is interested in the supply side and growth, that it might do some of the divergence activities that actually the Tories never got round to, on things like novel proteins, novel food technologies, AI. You know, if you're not going back in, no single market, no customs union, no free movement, actually the logic is that you do something different. You might well not offset the costs of being out, but those are increasingly sunk now anyway. And actually, if you're not going to, you can't be half pregnant with the EU. So it may be that Keir Starmer decides that we end up going further away when it becomes apparent the limits of the negotiation.